You know, one of the most fascinating things about human dynamics, especially in emotionally charged relationships, is how power quietly shifts the moment one person stops reacting. When we talk about the avoidant and the super empath, this shift is seismic. The avoidant, for so long, holds the upper hand. They thrive on distance. It's their comfort zone. They know how to withdraw, how to stay emotionally unavailable just enough to keep the other person chasing their approval, trying to decode their moods, overanalyzing every word or silence. That dynamic gives them a sense of control. It makes them feel safe, even superior. But here's the thing. When the super empath, the one who has spent months or years trying to understand, connect, and hold the emotional space for both people, suddenly detaches, the entire structure collapses. The avoidance strategy doesn't work anymore. Their emotional game plan is built on reaction, on knowing that the empath will feel, care, and keep trying. So when that energy stops flowing, when the empath goes still and stops engaging, the avoidant loses their anchor. They're left with nothing to push against, and that's when the panic begins. This is what I call the power shift dynamic. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with a fight or a confrontation. It's quiet. It's internal. It's energetic. The empath stops participating in the emotional loop, and that silence, that non-reaction, becomes deafening to the avoidant. Now, let's unpack why this happens on a psychological level. Avoidants are often operating from a deeply rooted fear of intimacy and engulfment. They want closeness, but it terrifies them because it threatens their sense of autonomy and control. So they pull back, not because they don't care, but because closeness activates their nervous system. It feels unsafe. The empath, on the other hand, is wired for connection. They feel deeply, intuitively. They pick up on every shift, every micro expression, every emotional cue. For them, love is about healing and harmony. So when these two come together, the empath naturally takes on the emotional labor. They reach out, soothe, explain, and overextend. The avoidant, meanwhile, retreats further, often mistaking the empath's efforts as pressure or neediness. It's a cycle of misinterpretation that keeps both people locked in frustration. But something profound happens when the empath wakes up to this imbalance. There comes a point where exhaustion outweighs empathy. The super empath realizes that constantly pouring into someone who cannot or will not meet them halfway is a slow form of self-erasure. And when that realization hits, they don't explode, they withdraw. Not in anger, but in clarity. It's a quiet withdrawal, almost serene. And this is where the shift begins. Because for the first time, the avoidant can no longer define the emotional terms. They can no longer control the pace of connection or disconnection. The empath's detachment removes the avoidant's emotional leverage completely. This throws the avoidant off balance, often more than they'd ever admit. You'll see it in subtle ways. The sudden check-ins, the random, "Hey," messages, or the attempts to re-engage through passive curiosity. It's not because they've suddenly evolved. It's because the loss of control is disorienting. They're used to being the emotionally cooler one, the one who doesn't care as much. But the super empath's detachment outcools them in the most unexpected way. It's not a performance. It's authenticity. It's peace. The power shift dynamic, then, is not about revenge or superiority. It's about balance being restored. For the first time, the empath stops operating from emotional survival and starts operating from self-respect. The energy that was once externalized toward fixing, understanding, explaining, gets redirected inward. That's what makes it so powerful, because the empath is no longer playing by the avoidance emotional rules. They've stepped out of the dance entirely. And what's truly poetic about this reversal is how quietly it happens. There's no big declaration, no ultimatum, no drama. The super empath simply stops chasing what was never running toward them. And in doing so, they reclaim their emotional sovereignty. The avoidant, on the other hand, is forced into a reality they've spent their whole lives trying to avoid. Emotional accountability. When there's no one left to absorb their silence, justify their distance, or overcompensate for their withdrawal, they have to sit with themselves. And for many avoidants, that's a mirror they've spent years trying not to look into. This is the essence of the power shift dynamic. It's not that the empath suddenly becomes cold-hearted. It's that they finally become self-protective. They stop feeding the dynamic that drained them. They understand that silence isn't a weapon, it's a boundary. And that boundary is the beginning of their freedom. Because the moment the empath detaches with clarity, the avoidance illusion of control dissolves. What's left is truth. Raw, undeniable truth. The avoidant wasn't strong because they were distant. They were strong because someone kept caring enough to bridge the distance. So when that bridge is gone, when the empath stops walking across it, the power doesn't just shift, it returns home. And that's the lesson right there. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to fight harder, but to stop participating in what keeps you powerless. It's easy to think of the avoidant as the one who doesn't care, the emotionally detached, self-contained, independent figure who doesn't need anyone. That's the illusion. But underneath that image lies something very different. The avoidant may look indifferent, but they are deeply, almost unconsciously, dependent on the emotional energy of the empath. They depend on it the way a plant depends on sunlight, quietly, consistently, and without ever admitting it. See, what most people don't realize is that emotional avoidance isn't the absence of emotion. It's a defense against being overwhelmed by it. The avoidant has learned, usually early in life, that love comes with pain, that vulnerability invites rejection, that needing someone makes you weak, so they build a wall. But walls don't make you self-sufficient, they just make you lonely. And when that loneliness becomes unbearable, the avoidant finds someone who feels deeply, someone whose emotional warmth compensates for what they've cut off in themselves. That's where the empath comes in. The super empath is not just kind or understanding. They are emotionally intelligent on a cellular level. They intuit what others need. They sense the undercurrents of a room, and they can love through discomfort. For an avoidant, that's intoxicating. The empath becomes the emotional regulator in the relationship, the one who holds space, who grounds, who translates silence into meaning. And even though the avoidant might push them away, that emotional availability becomes their lifeline. Here's where it gets interesting. The avoidant feeds on that steady emotional current without realizing it. It's like they're standing close enough to the fire to feel its warmth, but too afraid to step in. They draw comfort from knowing the empath is there, always caring, always understanding, always available. That predictability soothes them. It's not love as much as it is emotional survival. But this dependency is hidden even from themselves, because to admit they rely on someone else's emotional stability would shatter the avoidant's identity as the one in control. Their entire coping mechanism depends on the belief that they don't need anyone. So they convince themselves that their distance is strength, that their independence is freedom. Meanwhile, they're quietly tethered to the empath's consistency. Now imagine what happens when the empath finally detaches. When the texts stop, the check-ins fade, and the emotional reassurance disappears, the avoidant finds themselves in uncharted territory. That quiet they once claimed to crave becomes unbearable. The absence of the empath's presence exposes a truth they've never faced before. They weren't actually comfortable being alone. They were comfortable being pursued. And that's the emotional starvation point. Because for the first time, the avoidant has to sit in the silence they created. They don't have the empath's warmth to regulate their emotional distance anymore. There's no soothing voice, no empathetic energy bridging the gap. Just them and the emptiness they've been running from. This is where the mask begins to crack. Some avoidants in this phase might reach out in confusing ways. They might send mixed signals, reappearing just enough to see if the empath is still available, still willing to give. They don't necessarily want reconnection. They want reassurance that the supply still exists. That emotional source, that steady validation, is gone, and it leaves them feeling destabilized. For the empath, understanding this is critical, because it reframes the dynamic. It's not that the avoidant doesn't care. It's that they've built a relationship style that requires someone else to do the emotional heavy lifting for them. And when that person stops, they're forced to confront a hunger they've been denying their whole lives. Philosophically, this is the paradox of avoidance. In trying so hard not to depend on anyone, they become completely dependent on those who are willing to do the emotional work. The avoidant's greatest fear, needing someone, is the very reality they've been living all along, just in disguise. That's why the empath's ice, cold detachment hits so hard. It's not just a breakup or a withdrawal. It's the removal of an emotional oxygen line. The avoidant can't handle it, not because they've lost a partner, but because they've lost access to the emotional ecosystem that made them feel safe while pretending to be independent. And this is where growth can happen for both people, if they're willing. The empath learns that love doesn't mean self-sacrifice, that emotional giving must have limits. And the avoidant, if they're brave enough, gets to face the truth that their avoidance was never strength. It was fear wearing armor. There's a deeper layer here, though. The empath's withdrawal forces the avoidant into self-contact. For the first time, they have to feel their own emotions without someone else absorbing them. They have to regulate themselves, reflect on their patterns, and decide whether they want to keep living in emotional starvation or finally risk genuine intimacy. It's painful, but it's transformative, because emotional starvation, at its core, isn't about missing someone, it's about missing connection. And connection, real connection, can't exist behind walls. It requires vulnerability. It requires showing up as you are. When the empath detaches, they're not punishing the avoidant. They're liberating both of them from a cycle of dependency disguised as love. It's a harsh truth, but a necessary one. You can't heal in relationships where one person feels everything and the other feels nothing. And maybe that's the takeaway here. Emotional independence isn't about isolation. It's about integrity. It's the ability to stay connected without losing yourself, to care without collapsing, and to love without needing someone else to carry your emotional weight. Because in the end, the avoidance hidden dependency teaches us all one thing. When you starve others of your vulnerability, you eventually starve yourself of connection. There's a point in every emotionally imbalanced relationship where silence becomes the most powerful mirror. When the super empath finally detaches, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, that silence isn't empty, it's reflective. It becomes a mirror held up to the avoidant, forcing them to see themselves with no distractions, no emotional cushioning, and no one left to absorb their chaos. And here's what's so fascinating: the avoidant, spends most of their life running from mirrors. They don't like to look too deeply into their own emotional world because what's inside feels unpredictable, overwhelming, even foreign. Their detachment has always served a purpose to protect them from the discomfort of feeling too much. But when the empath stops trying, stops chasing, and stops explaining, there's nowhere left for the avoidant to hide. The silence that used to feel safe now feels suffocating. What happens next is almost psychological whiplash. The avoidant, who once felt in control because of their emotional distance, suddenly feels exposed. They're confronted by the emotional vacuum they created, and it's not peaceful. It's echoing. It's like standing in an empty room that used to be filled with warmth, realizing you were the one who opened all the windows and let the heat escape. That's the mirror effect. The empath's withdrawal doesn't just remove their presence. It reflects the avoidant's own internal emptiness back at them. For the first time, they feel the absence they've been inflicting. They experience the loneliness they've been avoiding. And that's the moment where the truth becomes impossible to deny. The disconnection they've always blamed on others actually starts within themselves. This realization can be brutal, because up until now, the avoidance identity has been built on control. Control of emotion, control of attachment, control of narrative. When the empath was around, that control worked. The empath's empathy filled in all the blanks. The avoidant didn't have to explain, didn't have to confront, didn't have to reflect. The empath's compassion kept the relationship emotionally alive. But when that source of warmth disappears, the avoidant's own emotional world becomes impossible to ignore. Psychologically, this is the moment when suppression meets reality. Avoidants often compartmentalize their feelings. They tuck them away neatly and tell themselves they've moved on. But human emotion doesn't just vanish. It stores itself in the body, in the nervous system, in the subconscious. And when they're finally left alone, without the empath's grounding presence, all that suppressed material starts to surface. It's confusion, restlessness, sometimes even panic. Because what they're facing isn't just the loss of another person. It's the confrontation with everything they've tried not to feel. And the irony here is profound. The avoidant has spent the relationship trying to avoid vulnerability because they equate it with pain. Yet when they're finally alone, the absence of vulnerability hurts even more. That emotional emptiness, that numbness, becomes unbearable. They start to crave what they once dismissed, the depth, the warmth, the connection. But the empath's silence doesn't offer it anymore. It only reflects the void back at them, like a clean mirror showing a truth they can't unsee. Now, for the empath, this can be an empowering but bittersweet realization. Because what the empath often doesn't realize is that their presence was holding space not just for love, but for the avoidance healing. They were the emotional translator, the safe harbor, the mirror that softened reality. When they detach, that mirror becomes unfiltered. The avoidant sees themselves clearly, maybe for the first time, and it's not flattering. It's raw. But this moment is also a potential turning point, because that confrontation, as painful as it is the gateway to growth. The avoidant can either retreat deeper into denial, seeking distractions, new relationships, or emotional numbness. Or they can start to do the real work. They can begin asking the hard questions. Why do I fear closeness? Why does love make me anxious? Why do I equate emotional safety with danger? But the mirror effect isn't meant to humiliate. It's meant to awaken. It's the moment life forces you to face the parts of yourself you've abandoned. For the avoidant, it's the recognition that their emotional self isn't dead. It's just buried. And the empath's detachment, though painful, becomes the catalyst for rediscovery. Philosophically, this is the essence of shadow work. Carl Jung talked about how we all have disowned parts of ourselves, the aspects we repress because they make us feel weak, unworthy, or afraid. For avoidants, that shadow is their emotional self, the part that longs for love, connection, and tenderness but doesn't know how to receive it. The empath's silence shines a light on that shadow. It exposes what's been hidden. And that exposure, while uncomfortable, is what makes healing possible. So yes, when the empath detaches, the avoidant struggles, but it's not punishment. It's reflection. It's life holding up a mirror and saying, this is what your disconnection looks like. This is what it feels like. And if the avoidant has the courage to stay with that discomfort instead of running from it, something extraordinary can happen. Awareness, accountability, emotional rebirth. For the empath, understanding this truth brings peace because it reminds them that silence can be an act of love, not for the other person, but for themselves. By stepping back, they allow the other person to meet their own emptiness head on. And sometimes that's the most compassionate thing you can do. Stop cushioning someone from their own awakening. Because at the end of the day, mirrors don't lie. They only reflect what's already there. And if you can face what you see without turning away, that's where transformation begins. So if there's one takeaway here, it's this: silence isn't absence. It's reflection. And sometimes the most powerful mirror you can hold up for someone is the space you leave behind. There's a moment in every empath's journey where they finally understand that detachment isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's that moment when the super empath realizes that constantly rescuing, explaining, or softening themselves to be understood isn't compassion anymore. It's self-betrayal. And when they finally stop doing that, when they stop emotionally overfunctioning, it's not because they've turned cold. It's because they've grown wise. For the avoidant, this sudden shift can feel shocking. They've always associated the empath's warmth with predictability, with safety. They expected it to always be there, even after withdrawal, dismissal, or indifference. But when the super empath detaches, what they're witnessing isn't vengeance, it's evolution. This is the empath stepping into emotional mastery. It's the point where sensitivity becomes strength. And it's important to understand what detachment really is, because a lot of people confuse it with indifference. Detachment isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling everything and still choosing peace. It's emotional regulation on a deep, spiritual level. The empath who used to absorb everyone's energy now knows how to hold their own. They've learned that empathy, without boundaries, leads to depletion, and that loving someone doesn't mean tolerating emotional instability. This transformation is powerful because it comes after so much internal struggle. The super empath doesn't just wake up one day detached. They earn that peace. It's the product of endless overextension, of giving too much, of trying too hard. It's born from heartbreak, from realizing that no amount of love can make someone ready to receive it. And once that realization sets in, something inside them shifts permanently. They no longer chase connection. They embody it. Now, what's fascinating is how the avoidant interprets this. Because to them, detachment looks like rejection. They read silence as punishment. They misinterpret boundaries as hostility. They can't yet grasp that what they're seeing isn't an emotional shutdown. It's emotional balance. The empath hasn't stopped caring. They've simply stopped sacrificing themselves in the process. This is emotional maturity at its highest form. The super empath no longer seeks validation through caretaking. They've moved from reactive to responsive. They don't need to prove their goodness, their loyalty, or their worth through overgiving. They understand that love rooted in imbalance isn't love, it's dependency wearing a disguise. And so, they pull back not out of resentment, but out of respect, both for themselves and for the truth of the situation. Detachment, at its core, is the reclaiming of emotional energy. It's the realization that peace is more valuable than proximity. It's the quiet understanding that not everyone deserves access to your heart just because they need it. For the empath, this is liberation. For the avoidant, it's disorientation. Because suddenly the script has flipped. The avoidant can no longer provoke emotion, no longer elicit the same reactive warmth that made them feel powerful. Their tactics, silence, distance, emotional teasing, lose their effect. The empath's energy is no longer something to manipulate. It's something the avoidant has to meet at eye level. And for someone who's built their sense of control on emotional avoidance, that's deeply unsettling. But here's the philosophical beauty of it all. The empath's detachment doesn't harm, it heals. Not in the way the avoidant expects, but in a way that rebalances the dynamic. The empath's calm withdrawal forces both people to confront the truth that real love cannot exist without accountability, reciprocity, and presence. That no one can sustain a connection where only one person is emotionally awake. In many ways, this is where the empath's story becomes one of empowerment rather than endurance. They no longer define love as endless giving. They define it as alignment, shared emotional responsibility, mutual respect, and peace. And they realize that if peace requires distance, then distance is an act of self-love. You see, detachment isn't about walking away cold. It's about walking away conscious. It's understanding that you can't save someone from their own emotional avoidance. You can only model what wholeness looks like. The empath's stillness becomes a kind of silent teaching. This is what emotional maturity feels like. This is what peace sounds like. And whether the avoidant recognizes it or not, that stillness changes the dynamic forever. When the empath detaches, they stop living from reaction and start living from intention. They no longer try to change others. They change their own energetic response. They choose silence not to wound, but to preserve. They choose boundaries not to punish, but to protect. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because in the end, emotional mastery isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your own energy. It's knowing when to engage and when to release. It's the strength to love someone without losing yourself, and the wisdom to let go when holding on becomes self-destructive. For the avoidant, this detachment is a shock to the system. For the empath, it's a return to self. And for both, it's an invitation to evolve, to feel, to finally grow beyond the patterns that kept them trapped. So if there's one truth I want you to remember from this, it's this: detachment isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of self-respect. Because sometimes the most powerful way to love yourself and others is to stop rescuing what refuses to rise. When we talk about relationships built on imbalance, especially between an avoidant and a super empath, there's always this unspoken dynamic of control running beneath the surface. The avoidant, consciously or not, builds their emotional safety on that control. They control the pace of intimacy. They decide when to engage and when to withdraw. They manage closeness like a dimmer switch, never off, never fully on. And for a long time, it works. It gives them the illusion of power, of emotional autonomy. But it's just that, an illusion. Because control built on emotional avoidance isn't stability. It's fragility dressed as confidence. Now, here's the irony. The super empath, in their emotional generosity, actually helps sustain this illusion. They adapt to the avoidance rhythm. They make excuses for their distance. They fill in the silence with compassion. The empath does it because they love deeply, because they see potential, because they believe patience can heal everything. But what they don't realize is that this accommodation is the fuel that keeps the illusion alive. Every time they explain away neglect or justify inconsistency, they unconsciously validate the avoidance belief that they can control connection without ever having to be vulnerable. That balance holds until the empath stops playing their part. The moment the empath detaches, the entire structure starts to shake. The avoidant, who's built their emotional identity around being untouchable, suddenly feels a sense of loss they can't intellectualize. They start to feel what the empath has felt all along: uncertainty, powerlessness, vulnerability. And that's where the control illusion collapses. Because control, at its core, depends on predictability. And the empath's detachment removes that. The avoidant no longer knows what to expect. The usual cues are gone: the reassurance, the emotional chasing, the soft explanations. There's no one left to regulate the temperature of the connection. For the first time, the avoidant is in emotional freefall. And here's the deeper truth. What they're losing isn't control over the empath. It's control over themselves. The distance, the coolness, the aloofness. It all used to make them feel safe. But when the empath is no longer reacting, that same distance starts to feel like isolation. The silence they once used as a weapon turns into a mirror they can't escape. They realize, often too late, that emotional control isn't the same as emotional safety. In fact, the tighter they've tried to grip, the emptier they've become. Psychologically, what's happening here is a dismantling of defense mechanisms. The avoidance control strategies, withdrawal, dismissal, minimization, are forms of emotional armor. They're ways of protecting the self from rejection. But when the empath detaches, those strategies stop working. The armor becomes heavy. The avoidance stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like confinement. It's as if their emotional fortress has become a prison of their own making. Meanwhile, the empath, on the other hand, is experiencing something entirely different. For them, detachment isn't about control. It's about surrender. They're not trying to manipulate the outcome. They're simply choosing to stop playing a losing game. This is emotional maturity in its purest form. They no longer need to prove their worth through endurance. They've realized that love without mutual presence is just self-sacrifice in disguise. And the beauty of this shift is that it reveals how fragile control really is when it's not rooted in authenticity. The avoidant thought they were in charge of the emotional narrative, but it turns out their control was completely dependent on the empath's participation. Once the empath steps out of the dynamic, there's no stage left for the avoidance performance. Their power evaporates because it was never real to begin with. It was borrowed from the empath's willingness to engage. This is what makes the collapse so disorienting for the avoidant. They're not used to being on the receiving end of indifference. They're used to being chased, analyzed, forgiven. When that pattern ends, they have to confront the emptiness underneath their detachment. It's not the empath's silence that hurts them. It's the realization that they no longer have control over someone else's emotional world. And for a person who's built their identity on managing distance, that loss of control feels like an existential threat. But this collapse, as painful as it is, also holds the potential for awakening. Because once the illusion shatters, there's an opportunity for truth to enter. The avoidant can finally see that real strength doesn't come from control. It comes from connection. That emotional safety isn't about keeping people at arm's length. It's about learning to stay when it feels uncomfortable. For the empath, witnessing this collapse can be bittersweet. There's a quiet vindication in it, but also compassion. They can see clearly now that what looked like dominance was really fear. What looked like disinterest was actually self-protection, an understanding that allows the empath to release resentment and move forward with peace instead of bitterness. This is the philosophical heart of it. All illusions of control eventually collapse under the weight of truth. Because control is external, it relies on managing outcomes, people, emotions. But truth is internal. It doesn't need to be managed, only acknowledged. And when the empath withdraws their energy, the avoidant is left with nothing but truth. No more games, no more pretense. Just the raw, unfiltered realization that the one thing they tried so hard to avoid, emotional vulnerability, is the only thing that could have set them free. So if there's one lesson in the collapse of the control illusion, it's this: real power doesn't come from control. It comes from consciousness. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let the illusion fall and watch what's real finally stand on its own. When the super empath finally reaches the point of detachment, something extraordinary happens. For the first time, they stop chasing peace through another person and start creating it within themselves. It's a subtle but profound shift, the kind that doesn't make noise, but changes everything. The pursuit ends not because they've stopped caring, but because they've started understanding. You see, the empath's journey has always been about love, but often love distorted by imbalance. They've poured themselves into others, believing that if they could just love enough, explain enough, give enough, something would shift. They thought connection was something they had to earn. And when they met the avoidant, someone emotionally elusive and distant, that instinct went into overdrive. They mistook emotional inconsistency for mystery, withdrawal for depth, and silence for challenge. But now, at the end of that cycle, the super empath understands something crucial: peace is not found in pursuit. It's found in alignment, in choosing what and who feels balanced, mutual, and true. And that realization feels like liberation. It's not loud. It's not defiant. It's steady. It's calm. It's a kind of emotional freedom that says, I no longer need to prove my value through my suffering. The empath has learned the hardest lesson of all, that love without reciprocity is not love, it's self-abandonment. And in walking away, they're not giving up on love, they're redefining it. They're no longer impressed by intensity. They crave consistency. They no longer chase potential, they look for presence. That's emotional evolution in its purest form. Now, here's the part that often gets misunderstood. When the empath detaches, it's easy for outsiders, or even the avoidant, to assume they've gone cold. But this isn't coldness, it's clarity. They haven't shut down, they've opened up to themselves, to their own energy, to their own emotional world that for so long they neglected in the name of someone else's comfort. There's a quiet power in that, because the empath's peace is not passive. It's chosen. It's intentional. It's the result of no longer outsourcing emotional stability to people who can't meet them where they are. The super empath stops seeking permission to rest, to disconnect, to exist independently of someone else's validation. And in that autonomy, they discover something remarkable. They were never asking for too much. They were just asking the wrong person. Philosophically, this liberation represents a return to equilibrium. The empath has spent years, or maybe a lifetime, living in extremes. Too much giving, too much feeling, too much explaining. Their emotional compass was always pointed outward. But peace requires inward orientation. It requires being rooted in one's own values, energy, and truth. When the empath reclaims that, they become untouchable, not because they're hard, but because they're whole. For the avoidant, this evolution can be disorienting. The empath's energy used to orbit around them. Now it's self-contained. The avoidant no longer feels the gravitational pull of constant attention, and in its absence, they may finally realize what they've lost. But here's the thing. By the time they do, the empath is no longer playing the same emotional game. They're not waiting. They're not hoping. They've moved from analysis to acceptance, from emotional survival to emotional sovereignty. And it's important to say this. Liberation doesn't mean the empath stops feeling. They still care. They still love deeply. They just no longer confuse love with tolerance. They've stopped believing that emotional endurance is the same thing as connection. They understand now that detachment isn't the absence of love. It's the protection of it. It's the act of saying, I can love you, but I can't lose myself doing it. This is the moment where the empath's story transforms from one of heartbreak to one of wholeness. Because peace, unlike pursuit, isn't dependent on anyone else's behavior. It's an internal state, something that no amount of avoidance, rejection, or emotional chaos can shake once it's established. And that's why it's so powerful. The empath's liberation is not just emotional, it's existential. It's the awakening to a simple but life-changing truth that love is meant to flow freely, not be pried out of someone's resistance. They understand now that healthy love doesn't require translation, guessing, or endurance. It requires reciprocity, and the moment that becomes non-negotiable. Everything changes. This liberation doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with peace that feels almost foreign at first. Quiet mornings without anxiety, evenings without overthinking, relationships where communication replaces confusion. It's the moment the empath realizes that stillness isn't emptiness, it's freedom. For the avoidant, this shift can act as a mirror. Just as we discussed earlier, they may finally feel the full weight of what they resisted, the safety, the warmth, the connection that the empath offered so freely. But by then, the empath has outgrown the dynamic entirely. Their detachment isn't a door slammed shut. It's a gate that leads inward, back to themselves. Because that's the ultimate transformation from needing validation to embodying self-worth. The empath doesn't walk away bitter. They walk away balanced. They don't stop loving. They start loving consciously. They learn to give without losing, to care without carrying, and to connect without clinging. That's the liberation. That's the quiet revolution. It's when you realize that peace was never something you had to chase in another person. It was something you had to remember within yourself. So if there's one truth that wraps up this journey, it's this liberation doesn't come from walking away from others. It comes from walking back to yourself. Because when you choose peace over pursuit, you don't lose love. You finally meet it where it's meant to live, inside you.